Long before Marvel's Black Panther dominated box offices, there was another Panther film that Hollywood wants you to forget. Mario Van Peebles' 1995 drama was the first narrative feature film ever made about the Black Panther Party, but behind its controversial storyline lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets, stunning casting choices, and one of the most explosive real-life reactions from the very people it portrayed. From Matrix connections to celebrity cameos you'd never expect, this forgotten film is packed with surprises. Fact 1. The real Bobby Seale trashed his own movie. When most people think about getting their life story told in Hollywood, they imagine it would be exciting to see themselves portrayed on the big screen. But for Bobby Seale, one of the founding members of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, watching Mario Van Peebles' 1995 film Panther was anything but a pleasant experience. In fact, Seale was so upset with how he was depicted that he publicly denounced the entire movie, calling it somewhere between 80% to 90% completely untrue. Seale didn't just quietly express his displeasure behind closed doors either. He went on record describing the film as a false slight invasion of my privacy, which is pretty strong language coming from someone who had spent decades in the public eye as a civil rights activist and political figure. This wasn't just a case of someone being picky about minor details or creative liberties that filmmakers often take with biographical stories. Seale felt that the movie fundamentally misrepresented who he was as a person and what the Black Panther Party actually stood for during the turbulent 1960s. What makes this situation even more unusual is that Seale was portrayed as one of the major characters in the film, played by actor Courtney B. Vance. The movie focused heavily on the relationship between Seale and his co-founder Huey P. Newton, making Seale's harsh criticism particularly damaging to the film's credibility. After all, when one of the real people your movie is supposed to be about says you got almost everything wrong, it raises serious questions about the accuracy of the entire story being told on screen. Fact 2. It's a father-son Van Peebles production. Panther represents one of the most unique family collaborations in Hollywood history, with the project being passed down from father to son in a way that kept the creative vision entirely within the Van Peebles family. The film was directed by Mario Van Peebles, but the story itself came directly from his father, Melvin Van Peebles, who had written a novel called Panther and then adapted his own book into the screenplay for the movie. This wasn't just a case of a son deciding to make a movie based on his dad's book either. Melvin Van Peebles was already a legendary figure in independent filmmaking, having made his mark in the 1970s with groundbreaking films like Sweet Sweetback's Bada Sess Song, which helped launch the blaxploitation genre and proved that films made by and for African-American audiences could be commercially successful. So when he wrote the novel Panther, it was always intended to eventually become a film project. What makes this collaboration even more interesting is that both men brought their own distinct perspectives to the project. Melvin had lived through the civil rights era and had first-hand knowledge of the political climate that gave birth to the Black Panther Party, while Mario had grown up during the aftermath of these events and could bring a more contemporary filmmaking approach to the historical subject matter. The father-son creative partnership extended beyond just the basic story structure too. Melvin's novel provided the foundation, but Mario had to figure out how to translate his father's written words into visual storytelling that would work for 1990s audiences. This meant taking the political themes and historical events that Melvin had explored in the book and finding ways to make them accessible and engaging for moviegoers who might not have lived through the turbulent 1960s and 70s. Fact 3. Matrix's Tank was Huey Newton first. Long before Marcus Chong became famous as Tank, the wisecracking operator of the Nebuchadnezzar in The Matrix, he had already taken on the challenging role of portraying one of the most important figures in American civil rights history. In 1995's Panther, Chong played Huey P. Newton, the co-founder and chief theorist of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, giving audiences a dramatic portrayal of the revolutionary leader who helped shape the militant wing of the civil rights movement. What makes this casting connection so fascinating is how both characters, despite being separated by decades and existing in completely different worlds, shared similar themes of resistance against oppressive systems. Newton was a real person who challenged police brutality and systemic racism in 1960s Oakland, while Tank was a fictional character who helped humans fight against machines in a dystopian future. Both roles required Chong to portray someone who was willing to risk everything to fight for freedom and justice. Chong's performance as Newton showcased his dramatic acting abilities, as he had to capture the intellectual intensity and political passion of a man who was both a brilliant political theorist and a controversial revolutionary figure. Newton was known for his articulate speeches about constitutional rights and his ability to quote legal statutes to police officers, which required Chong to master complex political dialogue and convey Newton's sharp intelligence on screen. The transition from playing a real-life revolutionary to a fictional freedom fighter 4 years later demonstrates Chong's range as an actor, though sadly his career took a different turn after The Matrix due to legal disputes with the filmmakers. This means that many people who remember him as the loyal tank might not realize he had previously brought one of America's most significant civil rights leaders to life on the big screen. Fact 4. Angela Bassett played Betty Shabazz twice. Angela Bassett holds the unique distinction of being the only actress to portray Dr. Betty Shabazz, the widow of civil rights leader Malcolm X, in 2 major Hollywood films, essentially making her the definitive cinematic version of this important historical figure. Her first portrayal came in Spike Lee's acclaimed 1992 biographical drama Malcolm X, where she appeared alongside Denzel Washington's powerful performance as the iconic civil rights leader, showing Betty as the devoted wife who supported Malcolm through his transformation and witnessed his tragic assassination. Just 3 years later, Bassett reprised the role of Betty Shabazz in Panther, though this time the context was quite different since the film focused on the Black Panther Party rather than Malcolm X's life story. In this second portrayal, Bassett had the opportunity to explore different aspects of Betty Shabazz's character, particularly her interactions with the younger generation of civil rights activists who had been influenced by her late husband's teachings and philosophy. What makes this double casting even more remarkable is that Bassett didn't just play the same character twice, she essentially became the go-to actress for representing Betty Shabazz during the 1990s surge of films about African American history and civil rights. Her performances helped introduce Betty Shabazz to audiences who might not have been familiar with her significant contributions to education and civil rights activism beyond her role as Malcolm X's wife. The fact that 2 different directors working on 2 separate major films both chose Bassett for this role speaks to her ability to capture the strength, dignity, and intelligence that Betty Shabazz was known for in real life. This casting decision also created an interesting continuity for moviegoers, allowing them to see the same actress portray this historical figure across different time periods and contexts within the broader civil rights movement. Fact 5. Both Chris Rock and Chris Tucker appeared. Panther managed to capture lightning in a bottle by featuring both Chris Rock and Chris Tucker in its cast, though at the time neither comedian had yet become the household names they would eventually become. This casting decision becomes even more remarkable when you consider that both actors would go on to become 2 of the most successful comedians and actors of their generation, making their shared appearance in this serious political drama a fascinating piece of entertainment history. Chris Rock appeared in the film playing a character with the memorable name Yuck Mouth, which was quite different from the polished stand-up comedy persona that would later make him famous through HBO specials and movies like Everybody Hates Chris. Meanwhile, Chris Tucker also had a role in the film, though his part was smaller compared to Rock's more prominent character. This was still early in both comedians' careers, as Rock was just beginning to gain recognition from his work on Saturday Night Live, and Tucker was still a few years away from his breakout role in Friday. What makes their joint appearance particularly interesting is that Panther was a serious dramatic film, dealing with heavy political themes about civil rights, police brutality, and revolutionary activism, which was quite a departure from the comedy work both men were known for at the time. The film required both actors to tone down their naturally comedic instincts and deliver more dramatic performances within the context of this historical story about the Black Panther Party. Looking back now, it's almost surreal to think that 2 future comedy legends appeared together in the same politically charged drama before either of them had achieved major stardom. Rock would go on to become one of the most influential stand-up comedians of all time, while Tucker would become famous for his high-energy performances in action comedies like the Rush Hour series. Fact 6. Bobby Brown was cast against type. When Bobby Brown accepted a role in Panther, it represented one of the most unexpected casting choices in the entire film, as the R&B superstar was stepping completely outside of his comfort zone to take on a dramatic acting role that had nothing to do with his musical career. Brown, who was at the height of his fame in the early 1990s, thanks to hit songs like My Prerogative and Every Little Step, played a character named Rose in what was essentially his first serious attempt at dramatic acting. This casting decision was particularly surprising because Bobby Brown was primarily known to the public for two things: his energetic dance moves and catchy pop songs, and his highly publicized and often troubled marriage to Whitney Houston, which had made him a constant fixture in tabloid headlines throughout the early 1990s. Neither of these aspects of his public persona suggested that he would be a natural fit for a politically charged historical drama about the Black Panther Party. The character of Rose that Brown portrayed was far removed from his flashy stage persona, requiring him to tone down his naturally exuberant personality and deliver a more subdued performance that would fit within the serious tone of the film. This meant that audiences who were used to seeing Bobby Brown as a high-energy performer had to adjust to watching him in a completely different context, playing a supporting character in a story about civil rights activism and political revolution. What makes this casting choice even more interesting is that it came at a time when musicians crossing over into acting was still relatively uncommon, especially for serious dramatic roles rather than light comedies or musicals. Brown's willingness to take on this challenging role showed a different side of his artistic ambitions, even though his acting career never developed beyond this early experiment. Fact 7. Real 1960s activists made cameos. Panther brought an unusual level of authenticity to its cast by including two genuine figures from the 1960s activist movement, giving the film a direct connection to the real people who had lived through the era being portrayed on screen. Dick Gregory, the groundbreaking comedian who had become deeply involved in civil rights activism throughout the 60s, appeared in the film playing a character called Reverend Slocum, while Jerry Rubin, one of the most famous radical activists of the decade, took on the role of a defense attorney. Dick Gregory was particularly well suited for his role because he had genuinely been part of the civil rights movement, having participated in numerous protests and demonstrations alongside Martin Luther King Jr. and other major figures of the era. Gregory had used his platform as a popular comedian to speak out against racism and social injustice, often at great personal and professional cost, so his appearance in Panther represented someone who had actually witnessed and participated in the kinds of struggles the film was trying to recreate. Jerry Rubin brought his own fascinating perspective to the project, as he had been one of the founding members of the Youth International Party, also known as the Yippies, and was famously one of the Chicago 7 defendants who were put on trial for conspiracy and inciting riots during the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Rubin's presence in the film was particularly meaningful because he represented the white radical activist community that had often worked alongside groups like the Black Panthers during the late 60s. Having these two authentic voices from the era appear in the film added a layer of credibility that most historical dramas can't achieve, since both men could draw on their actual memories and experiences from the time period to inform their performances and potentially advise other cast members about the realities of activism during that turbulent decade. Fact 8. Mario Van Peebles used edutainment approach. Mario Van Peebles had a very specific vision for Panther that he described using the term edutainment, which was his way of explaining how he wanted to combine serious historical education about the Black Panther Party with the kind of entertainment value that would keep mainstream audiences engaged throughout the entire film. This approach represented Van Peebles' belief that movies could serve as both learning tools and exciting entertainment, rather than forcing audiences to choose between being educated or being entertained. The edutainment concept meant that Van Peebles deliberately blended documentary-style elements, including real historical footage from the 1960s, with more traditional Hollywood filmmaking techniques like action sequences, dramatic confrontations, and thriller-style plotting. This hybrid approach allowed him to present factual information about the Black Panthers' community programs, their political philosophy, and their conflicts with law enforcement, while also delivering the kind of suspenseful storytelling that would appeal to moviegoers who might not normally be interested in a straight historical documentary. Van Peebles implemented this edutainment strategy through various filmmaking choices, such as using canted camera angles, vibrant colors, and energetic editing to create a visual style that was more dynamic and engaging than what audiences might expect from a typical biographical drama. He also incorporated elements of conspiracy thriller plotting, particularly in the film's later scenes involving FBI surveillance and infiltration, to maintain dramatic tension while still conveying historical information about the government's actual efforts to undermine the Black Panther organization. The edutainment approach was somewhat controversial because some critics felt that the entertainment elements, particularly the action-packed finale, detracted from the serious historical subject matter and made the film less effective as both education and entertainment. However, Van Peebles defended this strategy as necessary for reaching audiences who might otherwise never learn about this important chapter in American civil rights history. Fact 9. The soundtrack went gold, with 60-plus female artists. While Panther may not have been a massive box office success, its soundtrack became a genuine phenomenon that achieved something remarkable in music history by bringing together more than 60 female R&B singers and rappers for a single collaborative track. The soundtrack, which was released by Mercury Records on May 2, 1995, managed to reach gold certification status and peaked at number 37 on the Billboard 200 chart, while also climbing to number 5 on the top R&B and hip-hop albums chart. The centerpiece of this musical achievement was a song called Freedom Theme from Panther, which represented one of the largest musical collaborations ever recorded at that time, featuring an unprecedented gathering of female artists from across the R&B and hip-hop spectrum. This massive collaboration included established superstars, rising newcomers, and artists from various record labels who all came together to contribute their voices to this single track that served as the film's main theme song. The song itself managed to achieve commercial success beyond just the soundtrack album, reaching number 45 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart as a standalone single, which was particularly impressive considering the logistical challenges involved in coordinating so many different artists for one recording session. The soundtrack also featured other notable tracks, including Head Nod by Hodge and the Points, which was another collaboration featuring 12 of hip-hop's most popular artists and groups from that era. What makes this musical collaboration even more remarkable is that it happened during the mid-1990s, when the music industry was much less connected than it is today, making it far more difficult to coordinate recording sessions and bring together artists from different labels, management companies, and geographic locations for a single project of this magnitude. Fact 10. Father and son both appear on screen. The Van Peebles family collaboration on Panther extended beyond just the writing and directing duties, as both Mario and Melvin Van Peebles decided to make cameo appearances in the film itself, essentially turning the project into a true family affair, where 3 generations of the Van Peebles creative legacy appeared on screen together. Mario Van Peebles, who was already wearing multiple hats as both the director and producer of the film, took on the additional role of portraying Stokely Carmichael, the influential civil rights activist who coined the term Black Power, and was closely associated with both the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and later the Black Panther Party. Mario's decision to cast himself as Stokely Carmichael was particularly interesting because Carmichael was a major historical figure in his own right, having been one of the most prominent voices in the Black Power movement during the late 1960s. This meant that Mario had to step away from his director's chair periodically to perform as an actor portraying a real person who had played a significant role in the events his film was depicting. Meanwhile, Melvin Van Peebles, the legendary filmmaker who had written both the original novel and the screenplay adaptation, made his own appearance in the film, playing a much smaller but memorable role as a jailbird, essentially appearing as a prisoner character in one of the film's jail scenes. This casting choice was somewhat fitting given Melvin's reputation as a rebellious filmmaker who had always operated outside the traditional Hollywood system and had often portrayed outsider characters in his own work. The father-son on-screen appearances created an interesting dynamic where audiences could see the creative minds behind the project actually participating in the story they had crafted together, adding another layer to what was already a deeply personal family project about an important chapter in American civil rights history. Fact 11. Roger Ebert delivered a brutal review. When Panther was released in 1995, it faced the critical judgment of Roger Ebert, one of the most respected and influential film critics in America, and his review turned out to be absolutely devastating for the film's reputation. Ebert, who was known for his thoughtful and often generous approach to reviewing movies, delivered what can only be described as a scathing assessment of Mario Van Peebles' ambitious project, summarizing his disappointment with one particularly cutting line that became emblematic of the film's critical reception. Ebert's most memorable criticism came in the form of a single sentence that perfectly captured his frustration with the film. There is a fascinating study to be made of the Black Panther Party. Panther is not that film. This statement was particularly damaging because it acknowledged that the subject matter itself was inherently compelling and historically important, while simultaneously dismissing the film's execution as a complete failure to do justice to that important story. The veteran critic's main complaint centered around what he saw as the film's misguided decision to blend serious historical drama with fictional thriller elements, particularly in the movie's final act, where it devolved into what Ebert described as action sequences involving the mafia, the FBI, drugs, chases, the fires and explosions. He felt that these Hollywood-style dramatic flourishes completely undermined the film's credibility and distracted from the real story of the Black Panther Party's actual struggles and achievements. Ebert went even further in his criticism by describing the film as superficial and confusing, and argued that it cops out at the end with its fictional thriller climax, suggesting that the filmmakers had lost faith in the power of the real historical events and felt compelled to add sensationalized dramatic elements that ultimately made the film less effective rather than more entertaining. Fact 12. It features a Marilyn Monroe-style scene. One of the most unexpected moments in Panther comes right at the beginning during the opening credits, where Mario Van Peebles included a scene that pays direct homage to one of the most iconic images in Hollywood history, Marilyn Monroe's famous subway grate scene from The 7-Year Itch. In Van Peebles' version, a young boy riding his bicycle through the streets of Oakland notices a woman named Bernadette waiting at a bus stop, and as he watches with curiosity, a city bus passes by and creates a powerful gust of wind that blows her dress upward, in almost exactly the same way that Monroe's white dress was lifted by the subway air in the classic 1954 film. The scene plays out with the boy deliberately positioning himself to get a better view of what might happen when the bus approaches, showing the kind of mischievous curiosity that might be typical of a young person in that situation. When the bus does pass, and the wind catches Bernadette's dress, she responds with embarrassment and surprise, trying to hold down her skirt while also attempting to keep her hat from being blown away by the same gust of wind that caused her wardrobe malfunction. What makes this scene particularly interesting is how completely out of place it seems, within the context of a serious political drama about the Black Panther Party, yet Van Peebles chose to include it as part of his opening sequence, suggesting that he wanted to establish a certain playful tone or perhaps demonstrate the everyday life and innocent moments that existed alongside the more serious political events that would dominate the rest of the film. The inclusion of this homage also reflects Van Peebles' willingness to blend different cinematic styles and references throughout Panther, mixing classic Hollywood imagery with his contemporary storytelling approach to create something that was uniquely his own artistic vision. Fact 13. Rapper Kool Moe Dee had a role. Panther gained additional street credibility and hip-hop authenticity by casting Kool Moe Dee, one of the genuine pioneers of rap music, in a supporting role as a character named Jamal, bringing a real connection to the urban culture that had grown out of many of the same communities and social conditions that had given birth to the Black Panther Party decades earlier. Kool Moe Dee was already a legendary figure in hip-hop by 1995, having been one of the founding members of the influential rap group Treacherous 3 in the late 1970s and early 1980s, before going on to achieve solo success with hits that helped establish rap as a mainstream musical form. His appearance in the film was particularly meaningful because Kool Moe Dee represented the kind of authentic voice from the streets that could speak to the urban experience in a way that traditional Hollywood actors might not have been able to achieve. During the mid-1990s, hip-hop was experiencing what many consider to be its golden age, with artists using their music to address social and political issues that were directly connected to the same kinds of systemic problems that the Black Panthers had been fighting against in the 1960s and 70s. Kool Moe Dee's casting also reflected Mario Van Peebles' understanding that the Black Panther story would resonate with contemporary hip-hop audiences who were dealing with many of the same issues around police, brutality, economic inequality, and social justice that had motivated the original Panthers. By including a respected figure from the rap community, Van Peebles was able to bridge the gap between the historical period his film was depicting and the current cultural moment when the movie was being released. The rapper's presence in the cast helped establish connections between the revolutionary spirit of the Black Panthers and the socially conscious messages that were prevalent in hip-hop music during that era. Fact 14. The film cost $8 million worldwide. Despite having an impressive star-studded cast that included established actors like Angela Bassett, Courtney B. Vance, and Joe Don Baker, along with rising comedy stars Chris Rock and Chris Tucker, Panther turned out to be a significant commercial disappointment that failed to connect with mainstream audiences at the box office. The film managed to gross only $6,834,525 in the United States and Canada during its theatrical run, which was a surprisingly low number considering the ambitious scope of the production and the recognizable names attached to the project. When international box office earnings were added to the domestic totals, the film's worldwide gross reached just $8 million total, which meant that Panther likely lost money for its distributors and investors after accounting for production costs, marketing expenses, and theater revenue splits. This poor financial performance was particularly disappointing because the film had been positioned as an important historical drama that could potentially appeal to both mainstream audiences interested in civil rights stories and younger viewers who might be drawn to the hip-hop artists and comedians featured in the cast. The low box office numbers become even more striking when you consider that 1995 was generally a strong year for movies, with films like Toy Story, Batman Forever, and Apollo 13 all achieving significant commercial success during the same period. This suggests that Panther's commercial failure wasn't necessarily due to a weak movie market, but rather reflected audience indifference to the film's specific combination of historical subject matter and Mario Van Peebles' particular filmmaking style. The financial disappointment of Panther also had lasting consequences for Mario Van Peebles' career, as Hollywood studios became more reluctant to finance his subsequent projects, making it harder for him to get major films greenlit in the years that followed. Fact 15. It includes a geographic impossibility. Panther contains one of those geographical errors that only locals would likely notice, but once you know about it, it becomes the kind of mistake that's impossible to ignore during future viewings of the film. The error occurs during a chase scene where Detective Brimmer, played by Joe Don Baker, is pursuing the character Judge through the streets of Oakland, California, and needs to communicate his location to other officers via radio to coordinate the pursuit and potentially get backup assistance. During this tense moment, Brimmer makes a radio call to report that he is running east on Market Street in Oakland, which sounds like a perfectly reasonable piece of information for a police officer to relay during an active chase situation. However, anyone familiar with Oakland's actual street layout would immediately recognize that this radio call contains a fundamental geographical impossibility that reveals the filmmakers didn't do their homework about the real city they were using as their setting. The problem is that Market Street in Oakland runs in a north to south direction, which means it would be physically impossible for anyone to run east or west along that particular street, since those compass directions would require crossing the street rather than following it. This kind of continuity error suggests that the screenwriters or the actors delivering the dialogue weren't familiar with the actual layout of Oakland's streets, despite the fact that the city serves as the primary setting for the entire film and was historically the actual headquarters of the real Black Panther Party. While this might seem like a minor detail that most viewers would never notice, it's exactly the kind of mistake that can pull local audiences out of the story and make them question how much research the filmmakers actually did about the place where these important historical events actually occurred.